Alright, now, one thing that we use coterminal angles to kind of help us do is to find what we call reference angle, abbreviated reference REF, okay? So, a reference angle. I'm going to get them in just a minute. Alright, now, pay attention really close to what the definition is. And that's the thing about, when I talk geometry, I put a lot of emphasis on vocabulary. So, it's the same thing in trig. You have to really study your vocabulary to get an understanding of what's going on. You can't just do the numbers. Okay? You got to understand the vocabulary. This is one of these vocabulary things. Okay? So, a reference angle is an acute angle formed by the terminal side. Now, remember which side was the terminal side? Terminal side and the initial side. Go back and look. Okay. An acute angle formed by the terminal side and the x-axis. The terminal side, where was the initial side always? On the x-axis. So the terminal side was just wherever. Okay, it's where we stopped measuring. Okay, so here's the thing. We're not necessarily looking at the initial side of the terminal side. We're looking at the x-axis of the terminal side. So the two things to kind of really highlight here are these things. It has to be an acute angle, and it has to be formed with the x-axis. Okay, those two things. So it's not necessarily the positive x-axis, is it? Okay, and it being an acute angle means it has to measure less than 90. Okay, now what we can do here, we'll draw the first four that we do, and what we'll do is just come up with basically rules for each quadrant. Okay, so let's do one in the first quadrant, and we'll draw it out. Okay, then we'll do some more without drawing. So somebody give me like a nice multiple of 10 that would fall in the first quadrant. All right, you want to do 10 degrees? 10 degrees would be about right there, right? Okay. Now, if we want the reference angle here, the reference angle is the acute angle formed by the terminal side. Now, this would be the terminal side, right? The initial side is always this. Okay? The terminal side and the x-axis. Now, this is the x-axis. So we're looking for the measure of the angle, but from the terminal side and the x-axis. Now, wouldn't just that be the angle right there? So the reference angle for a 10-degree angle would just be 10 degrees. Okay. So the reference angle would be 10 degrees. Now, we said the terminal side and the x-axis. How come I can't form the reference angle like right here? Because that would be with the x-axis. That would be 170. Right? It has to be acute. And 170 wouldn't be acute, would it? It would be an obtuse angle. Alright? Now, what about this? What if somebody thought of this angle right here? Now, this angle would be acute. And if that was 10, then this would be 80, wouldn't it? But that would be the angle that's formed with the y-axis, and it's got to be formed with the x. Okay? Alright? Now, let's do one in the second quadrant. Alright, 160. Okay, that'd be a good one. It's really, I always like to do my angles like multiples of 10 because they're easy to do in your head. Alright, so 160. Let's find the reference angle. Okay, now, again, it's the acute angle formed by the terminal side and the x-axis.
So we have to say
So it would be...
we have to say 5.
No. Let's look at it. The x-axis. Now, I couldn't form it this way, could I? Because then it would be obtuse. So I would have to form it this way. So the reference angle would be this angle here. Now, we should know that this is 180 right here, right? And that's 160, so that angle would have to be 20. All right, y'all see how to find reference angles now? What? From the terminal side and the x-axis, and it has to be acute. All right, now that was one in the second. Let's do one in the third, and this we're going to develop rules so we don't have to draw it every. Okay. All right, somebody give me an angle, nice angle in the third.
210.
210. That'll work. Oh, let's just do 200. How about do 230? All right. All right. So 210 degrees. Now, by the way, let's go back to this one just a second. If I go back in this direction, this would be 80 degrees, or I'm sorry, not 80, but 70 degrees, right? 70 degrees is acute. Again, what's wrong with saying the reference angle is 70? Right, it's got to be formed with the x-axis. Okay. Now, let's look at this reference angle. So, if it has to be formed with the x-axis, am I going to look at this angle right here or this angle? The smaller one, right? Because it has to be acute. Okay. So the reference angle would be whatever this one measures. Now, if that's 180 and that's 210, then how many degrees did I really go from 180? 30. So the reference angle would be 30 degrees. Okay. And there again, what's wrong with saying this acute angle? When it's not formed with the x-axis, that will be formed with the y. We'll address that in a minute. Now, a reference angle will never be negative, but we could find the reference angle for a negative. We'll do that in a second. Now, let's do this. Let's do a fourth quadrant, and then we're going to write down the rules. All right, so give me a nice angle in the fourth quadrant.
350.
All right, that'll work. Shh, y'all be quiet. Now, so here again, this is what, 270. Can we say, well, that's just 80 more and say the reference angle is 80? It's going to be 10. Because it's got to be what? Formed with the x-axis, and it's got to be acute. So that reference angle will be 10 degrees. Now, all we've got to do is figure out, well, what was the pattern in each quadrant? And if I can identify what quadrant my angle's in, then I can just do simple calculations instead of drawing it and figuring it out every time. Okay? Because that's going to get old, drawing angles every time I have to do a reference angle. Now, so notice what happened in the first quadrant. The angle was 10 degrees, but the reference angle was also 10 degrees. So we'll write down a rule. So for quadrant 1, what was the relationship there? They're the same. Yeah. Whatever the angle is in the first quadrant, the reference angle is the same thing. Now, what about in quadrant 2? That's it. 180 minus the angle, right? Wouldn't that work every time? Because you're trying to get to the x-axis, which is 180. So you're just trying to get there. How many more do I have to go to get to 180? Now, what about in my third quadrant? Usually this is the one people kind of goof up a lot. Right. You're seeing how much more that it is than 180. So you take the angle and subtract 180 from it. So it's backwards from this one. Okay. So you do angle minus 180. Okay. Now, so you need to memorize these rules if you want to do this faster. Now, what about the fourth quadrant? Let's see if you can come up with that. 360. Yeah, 360 minus the angle. Okay. All right. So now, let's do this. I'm going to give you an angle, and this time I'm not going to draw it out. Okay. So the idea is if you figure out what quadrant that it's in, then you can figure out the reference angle without having to really do a whole lot. Okay, let's try. All right, let's find the reference angle, and let's see, we'll do 3 examples with you. 192 degrees. Okay, so think about it. And if you have to, you can draw it out. Okay, so 192 degrees would fall in what quadrant? The third quadrant, right? Now, what was the rule in the third quadrant? The angle minus 180. Okay, so we'd say 192 minus 180 would be 12. So my reference angle would be 12 degrees. Okay. Now, what if I couldn't figure that? What if I couldn't figure out, say, 192 minus 180? You could draw it, right? Okay. Now you got to think. That's 90. That's 180. That's 270, right? So 192 would be a little bit past 180 down here somewhere, right? So if that's 192, this would be the reference angle right there. So how much further is that from 180? Just 12 degrees. Okay. But again, what we try to strive for here is to get away from drawing. Okay. So we can just use those rules. All right. Let's look at this one. All right. Now, this one's going to throw you off a little bit. So watch carefully. Okay. What's up with that? What quadrant is that? That's more than right. If we can get it in between 0 and 360, then we can tell what quadrant it's in, right? You get what I'm saying? Okay. So what are we trying to find first instead of a reference angle? What's that term? Coterminal angle. Okay. So if we can find a coterminal angle first, then we can figure out the reference angle. So let's go for the coterminal angle first. All right, how do we find the coterminal angle? All right, subtract 360 as many times as you need. What if it's negative? Then you have to add 360. All right, so I think just one time is going to get it, isn't it? All right, 587 minus 360, y'all put that in for me. 227. Okay, now, so is this my reference angle then? No, that's just my coterminal angle. Now, I'm doing this so I can see what quadrant it's going to lie in. So 227 would be in the third quadrant. Okay, so all we have to do is just say what 227 minus 180 if it's in the third quadrant. Okay, so let's see, what's that going to be? Yeah, 47. Now, 47 would be my reference angle. Now, what about, let's do another one. Let's find our reference angle for negative 587 degrees. If your directions say to, I don't remember if it says to or not. Okay. Now, if we did, we would say, in this case it was second, in this case it was also second. Okay. If they did ask you for the quadrant, you could write it down. The reference angle is in the second quadrant. See, a reference angle is always going to be less than 90, but it's the acute angle formed with the x-axis. If your directions say that, your directions say it, do it. Okay. Now, what about my negative angle here? So, and I think you're going to have to add 360 twice. Okay, so y'all do that for me. Add 360 a couple of times.
Okay, can I ask a question?
All right.
How is it that 47 is in the second one?
Because it's the reference angle for this. 227 is down here in the, no wait a minute, it was in the third one.
Okay.
It was down here, right? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not sure. And I was thinking second, they were both in both. All right, now, if you added 360 a couple times, what does that give you? How much? 132? 33? Okay. Now, that's not my reference angle. Let's get our vocabulary straight. That is a coterminal angle. Okay? And so the coterminal angle is just a way to help me get to the reference angle. So 133 degrees would be in what quadrant? Second quadrant. So if it's in the second quadrant, you say what? 180 minus the angle. Okay? So I do 180 minus 133 would be, coincidentally, 47. And this one was in the, what quadrant though? Second, not the third quadrant. Now, I've got an understanding of reference angles. You want to go through the rules again real quick? Well, let's do it just in case. What if it's in the first quadrant? Same. Second quadrant, 180 minus the angle. Third quadrant, angle minus 180. Fourth quadrant, 360 minus the angle. Okay. Where's 133 at? Right, because that's where the angle, so the reference angle would be 47, but it would be the angle formed with the x-axis, okay, not from standard position. Now, this is what I didn't get to in my other class. Hang on just a second.